The stagecoach was a scar of dust and noise against the immense, silent backdrop of Sunset Valley. It creaked to a groaning halt in front of the small way station, its wheels settling like a tired beast. The door swung open, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, a figure had to duck deeply to clear the frame, emerging into the hard afternoon light. This was Anya. To the few idle eyes watching from the porch of the station, she was a sudden, startling shadow against the sun-drenched earth. She stood a full head and shoulders taller than the driver who offered a hand she did not need, her frame not willowy but solid, built with the strong architecture of her distant, mountainous homeland. The simple travel dress she wore did little to soften the broad line of her shoulders or the powerful curve of her arms. She was, in every sense, a giantess in this new land, and the weight of a lifetime of stairs settled on her like her own woolen cloak. Her eyes, a gray like winter stone, scanned the sparse surroundings, the dust, the timber buildings, the endless sprawl of grassland leading to purple-hazed mountains. This was to be her home. The idea was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She had come here across oceans and continents, propelled by letters exchanged with a man named Caleb. His words had been plain, kind, a rancher needing a partner for a hard, honest life. She had written back, careful, never mentioning her stature, a truth too large for ink and paper. Now, she stood exposed, waiting for the inevitable recoil, the laughter, the failed agreement. He was there, leaning against a hitching post by a sturdy wagon hitched to two calm draft horses. Caleb was a man carved from the landscape itself, sun-leathered skin, eyes the color of weathered slate, shoulders broad from years of wrestling cattle and weather. He watched the stagecoach empty, his gaze steady. When it landed on her, Anya braced herself. But his face did not twist into surprise or mockery. He simply pushed himself upright, took off his worn leather hat, and held it against his chest. He had to look up to meet her eyes, a subtle tilt of his chin she had seen from few men. The journey was long, he said, his voice a low, quiet rasp, like stone sliding over stone. You must be tired. No greeting, no question. Just a simple statement of fact, an offering of understanding. The words were so far from what she expected that she could only nod, the knot in her stomach loosening just a fraction. He moved to the back of the coach to collect her single, battered trunk. He hefted it easily, though she noticed the brief strain in his arms, a strain she knew she would not have felt. He placed it in the wagon bed with a soft thud. When he turned to help her up onto the seat, his hand was held out, palm up. It was a gesture of assistance, not assumption. Her own hand, large and capable, settled into his. His fingers closed around hers, his grip firm and warm, but not testing, not crushing. He simply provided an anchor as she climbed up, the wagon dipping slightly under her weight. He said nothing of it, just released her hand, walked around, and swung up beside her with a practiced ease. The ride to his ranch was a long, silent symphony of creaking wood and clinking harness. He did not fill the air with chatter, for which she was grateful. He pointed out things with a gentle gesture, a hawk circling on a thermal, the distant ribbon of the river that watered his land, the way the light caught the rim of the mountains. His quiet pride in this place was evident, a language spoken in nods and soft glances. Anya watched it all pass, this vast and daunting beauty, and felt both terribly small and overwhelmingly large all at once. His homestead appeared as the sun began to bleed gold into the sky. It was not grand, but solid, a cabin of timber and stone with a porch, a large barn, corrals, and pastures that melted into the wilderness. It spoke of a life of solitary toil. He brought the wagon to a halt and helped her down, his hands again respectful and sure. Inside, the cabin was clean, orderly, and masculine. A stone fireplace, a sturdy table, shelves of practical things. The air smelled of wood smoke, leather, and coffee. He showed her the small kitchen area, the pantry, the pump at the sink. Then he led her to the sleeping area. And there it was, the bed. It was a substantial piece of furniture, built from heavy logs, but it was clearly built for one man of Caleb's size. The reality of her new life, of the marital duties implied in her journey here, crashed upon her with a terrifying suddenness. The image of her large body and this man, the mechanics of it, the potential for awkward, painful failure, rose in her mind like a flood. She stared at the bed, then at him, her gray eyes wide with a primal fear. The words tumbled out, raw and unguarded. "Wait, you're putting that inside me?" Her voice was a strained whisper, thick with her foreign accent and a horror that was not of him, but of the act itself, which in her mind had always been portrayed as something a woman must endure, a fate surely worse for someone built like her. Caleb froze. For a long moment, the only sound was the crackle of the fire in the hearth. She saw a flicker of something in his slate-colored eyes, not offense, but a swift, deep understanding. He saw not just the words, but the lifetime of isolation and physical otherness that had birthed them. He let out a breath, slow and measured. "That's not how this works," he said, his voice even softer now, a gentle rumble. "That's not how anything here works." He took a step back, giving her space, making himself smaller in the room. "You are safe. Tonight, you sleep alone. The doors don't even have locks," he added, a gesture of profound trust, "because you are the only one who needs to feel safe here." He turned and gathered a blanket and a pillow from a chest. Without another word, he walked to the door. "There's stew on the hearth. Eat what you like." Then he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. Anya stood, rooted in the center of the room, listening. She heard his boots on the porch, the crunch of gravel, the distant groan of the barn door. He was giving her the entire house, the entire night, her own self. She moved to the window and peered into the deepening twilight. She saw a lantern kindle in the barn, a small, warm square of light in the vast, darkening valley. The knot in her stomach unraveled completely, leaving behind a hollow, aching confusion. She was alone, but not abandoned. She was a stranger, but not a spectacle. She had come fearing a transaction, a use for her body, and had found instead a fortress of quiet respect. As she finally turned and looked at the bed, it no longer seemed a threat, but merely a piece of furniture. And in the barn light twinkling in the distance, she saw the first, fragile ember of something she had not dared to hope for, a possibility of peace. The new rhythm of life at the ranch was a slow, deliberate cadence, set by the rising sun and the needs of the land. Anya awoke that first morning to the sound of Caleb already at work, the distant chop of wood, the low murmur to the horses. The cabin, which had felt like a borrowed shell the night before, was now hers to navigate in the clear light of day. She found the stew from the previous night, still warm in its pot near the banked coals, and ate a careful portion. The act felt significant, a first claiming of her place in this domestic sphere. She emerged onto the porch, squinting against the morning glare. Caleb was by the corral, mending a section of harness. He saw her, gave a single, brief nod of acknowledgement, and returned to his work. No fanfare, no demand for conversation. It was as if her presence, however monumental to her, was simply being woven into the existing tapestry of the day. This, she realized, was a kind of acceptance more profound than any welcoming speech. In the days that followed, she learned by watching. She learned where the feed was stored, how to pump water into the troughs without splashing, the specific, low whistle Caleb used to call the dogs. She was hesitant at first, moving with a conscious effort to minimize her size, to make herself smaller in the landscape. But the work was constant, and her body, trained by a different but no less demanding life, began to remember its own capabilities. The first revelation came at the feed shed. Caleb was hauling a heavy, 100-pound sack of grain onto his shoulder, the muscles in his back corded with the effort. As he turned, the sack caught on the doorframe, tearing slightly, and he stumbled under the shifting weight. Anya, without thinking, stepped forward. One large hand steadied the sack on his shoulder, the other gripped the bottom, and she lifted the burden from him as easily as if it were a pillow, settling it onto the storage platform. The air went still. Caleb stood, his shoulders rising and falling with his breath, looking from the securely placed sack to her. There was no embarrassment in his eyes, only a spark of reassessment. "Strong," he said, the word not an accusation but a plain fact, dropped into the quiet between them. A faint, unfamiliar warmth touched her cheeks. He began, subtly, to shift the chores. When a fence post along the south pasture needed resetting, he showed her how to dig the hole, set the timber, and pack the earth. He struggled with the heavy post, heaving it into position. "Here," he said, stepping back, his breath clouding in the cool air. "Your turn." Anya wrapped her arms around the rough-hewn wood, her back and legs engaging with a power that felt both natural and, in this new context, liberating. She slotted the post into the earth with a firm, final motion. Caleb tamped the dirt around it, his movements efficient. He glanced up at her, a hint of a smile at the corner of his eyes. "Good," he said. "Real good." It was the first praise she could remember receiving for her strength that did not feel like she was being commended for a useful oddity. Trust grew in these silent exchanges. He taught her to handle the big, gentle draft horses, and she found their size a comfort. They did not seem to find her strange. One afternoon, a crisis forged the next link. A late-born calf, curious and clumsy, had wandered into a patch of deep, sucking mud near the creek and was trapped, bellowing in panic. Caleb reached the bank first, his boots sinking immediately. Anya was right behind him. Without discussion, they waded into the mire. The mud was cold and greedy, clutching at them past their knees. Caleb looped a rope around the calf's chest as Anya positioned herself behind the terrified creature, her hands flat against its muddy flanks. On 3, Caleb grunted, his boots finding precarious purchase on a hidden rock. 1, 2, they pulled together, a united heave against the weight of the mud. With a great, wet suck, the calf came free, stumbling onto the solid bank. They staggered back, the sudden release sending Caleb off balance. Anya's arm shot out, catching him around the chest, holding him steady until he found his feet. They stood there in the muck, gasping, plastered from head to toe in cold, gray sludge, the calf bawling thankfully beside them. For a breathless moment, they simply looked at each other, their faces streaked, their bodies humming with shared effort and triumph. A laugh bubbled up in Caleb's throat, a rough, rusty sound, and Anya found herself echoing it with a soft exhale that was almost a giggle. It was the first sound of pure, unfettered joy between them. That evening, the physical memory of the day lingered. They cleaned up at the outdoor pump, taking turns working the handle. The sun was a dying ember on the horizon, painting the sky in washes of orange and violet. As Anya bent to splash water on her face, Caleb reached out. His fingers, calloused and warm, gently brushed a dried streak of mud from her cheekbone. The touch was fleeting, but it burned where his skin met hers, a point of searing contact in the cooling air. She went very still, her eyes meeting his. He didn't apologize or explain. He simply held her gaze, his own thoughtful, before turning back to the pump. Later, inside by the fire, she saw him wince slightly as he tried to flex his right hand, working out the stiffness from the day's labors. He fetched a basin of warm water from the hearth and sat at the table, soaking his hand, his profile etched in firelight. Anya watched him for a long moment. Then, driven by an impulse she did not fully understand, she rose. She pulled the other chair close, sat beside him, and without a word, took his left hand in both of hers. His skin was still damp, the tendons and knuckles prominent under her touch. He watched her, silent, as she began to knead the palm with her strong thumbs, working up each finger, applying a firm, steady pressure that knew exactly where the ache would lodge. His hand relaxed completely in her grasp, a surrender that felt more intimate than anything she had ever known. Her larger hands enveloped his, not to dominate, but to mend. The only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the soft sigh of his breath. In that quiet, tender ministry, something profound shifted. The strength she had always hidden was no longer a secret, nor was it merely useful. It had become a language, a bridge between them, speaking of care, of partnership, of a heat that was slowly moving from the hearth into the very space between their bodies. The change between them after the night of the mud-caked calf and the hand that was gently kneaded into peace was not a sudden shift, but a deepening of the current that had begun to flow. They moved around each other with a new, unspoken awareness, a dance where glances held a second longer and the passing of a tool from his hand to hers carried a silent charge. The vast valley seemed to hold its breath, the late summer air thickening, heavy with the promise of heat and change. The storm announced itself first as a stillness so profound the songbirds ceased their chatter. Then, a distant grumble rolled in from the western mountains, a sound like giant stones being dragged across the sky. The wind arrived not with a gust, but as a solid wall, screaming down from the peaks and setting the ranch to groaning. Caleb and Anya rushed through the final chores, securing animals and shutters as the first cold, fat drops of rain began to fall, hitting the parched earth like thrown pebbles. By the time they tumbled back into the cabin, the world outside had dissolved into a gray, howling fury. Rain lashed the roof and walls with such force it seemed a living thing trying to get in. The only bastion against the chaos was the fire Caleb built quickly in the great stone hearth, its flames casting a defiant, dancing light that pushed the shadows into the corners. Trapped together in that circle of warmth and light, the spacious cabin suddenly felt very small, the space between them charged with the energy of the tempest outside. Caleb stirred a pot of beans hanging over the fire. Anya sat at the table, mending a tear in one of his work shirts, her large hands moving the needle with surprising delicacy. The silence was not empty, but full, of the storm's rage and the crackle of the pine logs. It was Caleb who finally broke it, his voice a low rumble that competed with the wind. "My father built this place," he said, not looking at her, but into the flames. "Took him 10 years, log by log. He said a man needs a fortress against two things, the winter, and his own loneliness." He paused, feeding a twist of kindling into the fire. "He only ever found a cure for the first." Anya's needle stilled. It was the first time he had offered a piece of his past so freely. She found her own words, halting at first, carried on the rhythm of the storm. "Where I am from, the mountains are taller, and covered in snow always. People are close. In houses, in villages. But if you are different, you are alone in the crowd." She set the shirt down, looking at her own hands in her lap. "I was useful. For carrying, for lifting. Not for other things." Caleb turned now, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "What other things?" She met his gaze, the vulnerability feeling dangerous and necessary. "For sitting by the fire with. For talking to in the quiet. For wanting." The last word was barely a whisper, swallowed by a boom of thunder. He moved then, leaving his pot to simmer. He pulled his chair across the worn wooden floor to sit nearer to her, not touching, but close enough that she could see the flecks of darker gray in his eyes, the lines at their corners earned from squinting into sun and wind. "Anya," he said, and her name in his mouth, spoken with such deliberate care, felt like a new kind of touch. This land, it doesn't care about what's usual. A twisted tree grows strongest sometimes. A river finds a new path after a flood. Your sighs, he shook his head, searching. It's not a mistake. It's part of the landscape of you. And every part of you fits this life, the real work of it, the honest weight of it, better than you know. The truth of his words, spoken without poetry but with a bedrock certainty, washed over her. It unraveled a knot she had carried since girlhood. The wind screamed its approval outside. He reached out then, slowly, giving her every chance to retreat. His palm, rough and warm, cradled the side of her face, his thumb stroking the high arch of her cheekbone, a mirror to his touch at the pump but now laden with unbearable intent. Her breath caught. The world narrowed to the feel of his calloused skin against hers, the heat of the fire on her other side. "May I kiss you, Anya?" he asked, his voice a low thrum that vibrated through his hand and into her very bones. She could not speak, but she nodded, a slight, trembling movement. He closed the final distance. The kiss was not a claiming, but a question and an answer all at once. It started as soft as the brush of a moth's wing, a tentative meeting of lips that held the taste of coffee and wood smoke. Then it deepened, as a dam within them both gave way. Her hands, which had been clenched in her lap, rose to his shoulders, feeling the solid muscle beneath his shirt. His other arm slid around her back, pulling her from the chair, drawing her down with him onto the thick, woven rug before the hearth. They knelt together, bodies aligned, the firelight painting their skin in gold and umber. This time, when a small sound escaped her lips, it was not a word of fear, but a sigh of longing, a whispered, "Wait," that meant slowly, that meant "I want this," that meant "show me." He understood. With a reverence that made her heart ache, he began to undress her. Buttons were slipped free, laces untied, layers of fabric peeled away not with haste, but with a pilgrim's devotion. As each part of her was revealed, the powerful curve of her shoulders, the full swell of her breasts, the strong column of her waist, the formidable line of her thighs, he did not stare in shock or awe. He looked. And then he touched, his hands and mouth mapping her, learning the terrain of her strength. He kissed the hollow of her throat, the inside of her wrist, the powerful muscle of her stomach. He showed her that her body was not something to be overcome, but to be explored, a country of vast and beautiful contrasts. When he finally shed his own clothes and lay beside her, the difference in their size was simply a fact, a geometry of desire. He was hard and lean against her softness and power. He guided himself to her, his eyes locked on hers, and as he entered her, it was not an invasion, but a homecoming. There was no pain, only a stunning, full sensation of rightness. Her body, so often a burden, became a vessel of pure feeling. She gasped, her arms wrapping around him, and he groaned at the feel of being completely enveloped by her strength, held in a warm, powerful embrace that could have crushed him but only cherished him. Their loving mirrored the storm, a building of pressure, a rhythmic, driving force, a cascade of release that left them trembling. It was fierce and tender, hungry and generous. He moved in her, and she moved with him, discovering a rhythm that was theirs alone, a dance where her height and strength allowed her to meet him, to hold him, in ways that left them both breathless with discovery. The firelight danced over their joined forms, a primal scene of heat and surrender. When the final, shattering wave took them, it was together, a shared cry lost in the boom of thunder. They collapsed, limbs entangled, her larger form curling around his, sheltering him as much as he sheltered her. Sweat-slicked and sated, they lay on the hearth rug as the storm's fury gradually spent itself, fading to a gentle rain. In the quiet aftermath, with the fire warming their skin and his head resting on her chest, listening to the steady beat of her heart, Anya understood. The fortress his father had built had finally found its cure for the second, greater loneliness. And she, for the first time in her life, felt not just accepted, but truly, deeply desired. Every inch of her. The world after the storm was washed clean, the air sharp with the scent of wet sage and pine. Within the cabin, and within themselves, a new world had also been born. The tentative partnership had bloomed into a deep, physical knowing. Their days took on a richer texture, their nights a profound and hungry intimacy. Anya moved through her tasks with a new, quiet confidence, the memory of Caleb's hands and whispers a secret warmth against her skin. She learned the rhythm of his body as she had learned the rhythm of the ranch, and he, in turn, worshipped hers with a devotion that left her feeling powerful and precious. In their private kingdom of timber and pasture, she was not a giantess, but simply a woman, his woman. It was this newfound peace that Caleb sought to test, and to share, with the world beyond their borders. A supply trip to the town of Bitterbrush was necessary, nails and flour and salt could not be conjured from the land. As the wagon rolled away from the ranch, Anya felt the familiar, cold coil of dread in her stomach. The safety of the valley receded with each turn of the wheels, replaced by the exposed, public space of the settlement. Bitterbrush was a scattering of weathered buildings clinging to the dust. As Caleb helped her down from the wagon, Anya instinctively straightened her spine, lifting her chin, a shield of pride erected against the coming stairs. And they came, as inevitable as the tide. Conversations hushed on the porch of the mercantile. A woman hanging washing gaped openly, a clothespin frozen in her hand. Children pointed before being hastily swatted by their mothers. Anya felt each look like a physical touch, a cold, assessing poke. She focused on the rough grain of the boardwalk beneath her boots, the solid presence of Caleb at her side, his elbow just brushing hers. Inside the mercantile, the air was thick with the smell of leather, coffee, and dried apples. The proprietor, a Mr. Duggan, knew Caleb and gave a polite, if slightly strained, nod to Anya as Caleb listed their needs. For a moment, the routine of commerce provided a cover. But as Caleb examined a coil of rope at the back of the store, the door jingled open, and 3 ranch hands from a spread north of town swaggered in, smelling of cheap whiskey and horse sweat. Their boisterous talk died as they saw Anya. One, a large man with a beard like a thicket, let out a low, appreciative whistle that was anything but complimentary. His eyes traveled up and down her form with a brazenness that turned her blood to ice. "Well, I'll be hogtied and branded," the man drawled, his voice too loud in the quiet store. "Caleb, you old wolf, you didn't say your new mail order was a sturdy breed. Need a special mount for a filly that size, I reckon." Laughter, coarse and sudden, erupted from his companions. The words were a violation, reducing the profound, hard-won intimacy of her marriage to a crude, barnyard joke. Anya flinched as if struck, the color draining from her face. All her old fears, the lifetime of being seen as a useful oddity, came roaring back. She took an involuntary half-step back, her shoulders beginning to curve in on themselves. She never completed the step. Caleb was there. He had moved so silently, so quickly, that he seemed to simply materialize between Anya and the men. His back was to her, a solid wall of faded denim and worn cotton. The easygoing rancher was gone. In his place stood a man whose stillness was more threatening than any shout. The temperature in the room seemed to drop. His voice, when it came, was flat, cold, and carried the cutting edge of a skinning knife. "You will speak to my wife with respect." He did not look at the loud man, but at Mr. Duggan behind the counter, including the entire store in his decree. "Or you will not speak in this store again. You will not speak to me again. And if I hear you've spoken of her anywhere," he continued, his head turning just slightly, his slate eyes finally pinning the bearded man, you and I will have a fundamental disagreement about what a man is entitled to say." The silence that followed was absolute. The bearded man's grin had vanished, replaced by a blotchy redness. He was bigger than Caleb, but he withered under that calm, promise-laden gaze. He muttered something into his beard, tipped his hat with exaggerated mockery to no one in particular, and shuffled out, his friends following like chastised dogs. The bell on the door jingled with a pathetic, final sound. Caleb did not turn around immediately. He finished giving his order to a now pale Mr. Duggan, his voice returning to its normal, even tone as if he had just commented on the weather. Only when the goods were bundled and paid for did he finally face Anya. He said nothing, simply offered his arm. She took it, her hand trembling slightly on his sleeve. He covered it with his own, a firm, steadying pressure, and led her from the store, from the town, back to the wagon and the open road home. The journey back was silent, but the silence now buzzed with a different energy. The coiled dread in Anya's stomach had been replaced by a bubbling, hot spring of anger and humiliation. It fermented in the quiet, growing stronger with each mile. By the time the ranch came into view, the dam burst. She did not wait for him to help her down. She vaulted from the wagon, her movements sharp with fury, and stormed into the cabin, pacing its length like a caged animal. When Caleb entered, closing the door softly behind him, the words exploded from her in a torrent of her native tongue before switching to broken, passionate English. "They see a beast. A plow horse. They do not see me. They see a joke you married. Their eyes, their words, they stick to me." She was shaking, tears of rage and hurt now streaming down her face, all the confidence of the past week shattered by a single, vile comment. Caleb did not try to calm her. He did not tell her it was nothing. He simply stood, allowing the storm of her hurt to rage, his presence an anchor. When her words finally subsided into choked sobs, he crossed the room and pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a second, a stiff, proud statue, then collapsed against him, her face buried in the hollow of his neck, her large frame racked with grief. "They don't see you," he murmured into her hair, his voice a low, steady vibration against her. "They see a story they're too small to understand. I see the truth. I see the woman who mends my fences." He kissed her temple. "And my heart." He held her until the sobs quieted, until the tension left her shoulders. Then, with a tenderness that belied the fire in his own eyes, he led her to their bed. That night, their loving was not the tender exploration of the storm night, nor the joyful discovery that had followed. It was a reclamation. It was an answer. In the dark, Anya's hands found him with a new certainty. Her grief transformed into a fierce, protective desire. She pushed him onto his back, her body settling over his, not with shyness, but with a potent, claiming strength. She explored him now not as a student, but as a conqueror taking what was rightfully hers. Her mouth on his was hungry, demanding. Her hands, though strong, capable instruments of work, traced the lines of his chest, his stomach, his thighs, learning him anew, asserting her right to every part of him. Caleb yielded utterly, a groan of pure surrender escaping his lips as she took the lead, guiding him inside her, setting a rhythm that was powerful, possessive, and deeply healing. Here, in their private domain, her size was not a subject for mockery, but the source of her power. She could hold him completely, move with a strength that made his head spin, surround him with a warmth and security that was uniquely hers. He whispered it to her between gasps, "Your strength. Anya, it's everything." And in his willing surrender, in his worship of the very body the world had mocked, she found a healing more potent than any words. Their climax was not a gentle merging, but a powerful, synchronized claiming, of each other, of their union, of their right to exist as they were. Afterward, wrapped in the dark and the scent of their joined bodies, the cruel laughter of Bitterbrush seemed a distant, insignificant echo. The trust between them was no longer just a quiet understanding, it was a forged steel bond, tempered in the fire of outside scorn and proven unbreakable in the intimate fortress of their bed. She was his sanctuary, and he, hers. Time in Sunset Valley was not marked by calendars, but by the sun's arc, the greening and browning of the grass, and the slow, patient turning of the seasons. The sharp sting of the trip to Bitterbrush faded, not forgotten, but buried under layers of daily life and deepening love. It became a story they shared in glances, a reminder of the world's small-mindedness and the fortress they had built together. Anya no longer walked with the defensive pride of an outsider, she moved with the grounded grace of a woman who belonged to the land, and to the man who worked it by her side. Their intimacy, born in a storm and tempered by conflict, settled into a rich, sustaining rhythm. It was present in the easy way his hand found the small of her back as they passed in the yard, in the way she would lean down to rest her chin on the top of his head as he sat mending harness at the table. Their nights were a continuing dialogue of touch, a language where her strength and his steadfastness spoke in sighs and tangled limbs. He worshipped the powerful curves of her body not as a novelty, but as the familiar, beloved geography of home. She discovered a universe of sensation in the leanness of his frame, in the way he would murmur her name like a prayer into the skin of her throat when he found his release within her. The high summer heat began to mellow, bleeding into the golden, gentle light of early autumn. The aspen trees on the distant slopes flared into brilliant yellow. A profound sense of contentment, thick as honey, settled over the ranch. Yet, within Anya, a new secret was taking root, a quiet, internal shift more profound than any she had yet known. It began as a flutter, a vague, unfamiliar tide of fatigue that she attributed to the harvest work. Then came a tenderness in her breasts, and a peculiar, metallic taste in her mouth each morning. The realization dawned not with a shock, but with a slow, deep certainty that welled up from a place beyond thought. One evening, they sat together on the porch steps, watching the sunset paint the sky in washes of lavender and rose. The air was cool, carrying the scent of ripe grass and wood smoke. Caleb's shoulder was warm against her arm. She had been quiet for a long time, gathering her courage, feeling the truth of it pulse in time with her heartbeat. She took his hand, his work-roughened palm familiar and dear, and lifted it from his knee. Without a word, she placed it low on her belly, over the simple fabric of her dress, and held it there with both of her own. His fingers were still at first, uncomprehending. Then, as the meaning traveled from her touch, up his arm, and into his heart, she felt a slight tremor run through him. He turned his head slowly to look at her, his slate-colored eyes searching hers in the dimming light. The question was there, shining and vulnerable. "Something grows here," she whispered, her voice hushed with awe. "A new life. Our life." For a moment, Caleb was utterly still, a man carved from the very mountain stone. Then, his face, so often a mask of quiet reserve, underwent a transformation. It was as if the sunset had ignited within him. A joy so pure and unguarded broke across his features that it stole her breath. It was in the crinkling at the corners of his eyes, in the way his lips parted in a silent exhalation of wonder. He did not shout or whoop. He leaned forward, until his forehead rested gently against hers, his eyes closed, their breath mingling. A single, hard-won tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. "Anya," he breathed, her name encompassing everything, thanks, love, reverence, future. That night, in their bed beneath the heavy quilts, he spoke into the darkness, his voice painting pictures against the ceiling. He spoke of a bigger porch where a child could play, of a tiny saddle he would one day craft, of teaching a son or a daughter to read the weather in the clouds and the character of a horse in its eyes. His dreams, once solitary and practical, now unfurled to include a legacy, a family shaped by their unique love. She listened, her hand resting on the still flat plane of her stomach, imagining the heartbeat that would soon join the symphony of their own. In the following weeks, a new kind of intimacy bloomed. His touches grew even more tender, laced with a protective wonder. He would often simply lay his head against her belly, listening for a sign, his large hands splayed possessively over the cradle of their child. Their loving became slower, even more profound, a celebration of the life they had created. He would trace the faint, new lines of her body with a lover's devotion, whispering how beautiful she was, how the proof of their union was the most exquisite thing he had ever witnessed. On a night when the air was crisp and the stars hung like icy diamonds in the black velvet sky, they lay entwined in the aftermath of such gentle passion. Her head was pillowed on his chest, her larger body curved around his, one leg thrown over his in a possessive, protective arc. The quilt was a warm nest around them. There was no more waiting, no more fear of what was to come or what the world might think. There was only this, the steady drum of his heart under her ear, the faint, promising flutter deep within her, and the absolute certainty of their shared path. His voice rumbled softly beneath her cheek, a vibration of love and promise in the dark. "Every part of you, Anya," he said, his fingers stroking slow circles on the powerful line of her back. "Every part is home." And in the silent, starlit ranch house, surrounded by the sleeping land they tended and the future they had sown, the giant bride and the Lone Valley Cowboy finally, completely, were. If you've journeyed with Anya and Caleb from that first anxious meeting at the stagecoach to this quiet, hard-won peace, then you understand the power of a love story that finds strength in difference and heat in trust. For more tales of unexpected romance, deep connection, and the forging of passion against all odds, subscribe. New chapters of love, like new seasons in the valley, are always on the horizon.